The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the Nova Society are those of our guests and panel members and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of any institution any member of the Nova Society is associated with. The material information presented on the Nova Society is for general information purposes only. Reproduction or dissemination for the purpose other than education is prohibited without express written consent of the Nova Society. We'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society, and today our panel will be answering a question as we reach into our mailbag, and we're going to be answering a question from one of our many listeners, and the question is it possible that the United States could leave NATO? And what would that look like, not only to the United States, but to world politics as a whole? So we're going to tackle that question. Let's see what our panel has to say. All right, so this came out of the mailbag, and it's a question. And the question has to do with, would the U.S. leave NATO? And if so, what would that look like for world politics? So they're asking, is it possible that we might leave NATO if he who shall not be named gets elected? And if that was to happen, what would the United States leaving NATO look like?
Well, it would
Congress...
look like Go ahead, Brooke.
All right.
I'm not going to get too snarky about it.
No, that's right. Congress did put in a vote. They did vote for a bill, and it did pass, as far as I know, that would preclude a president's unilaterally withdrawing the country from NATO without the consent of Congress. And that was this Congress, which I found really quite interesting. However, whether a future Congress would agree to that and whether there might be workarounds to that so that a future President Trump could go ahead and do whatever he wanted to do. Do I think it's possible President Trump might withdraw the U.S. from NATO? Yeah, and as we were speaking, unfortunately, yes, I do think so. His argument, that idiotic argument of they're not paying their dues, as we were talking before, there are no such things as dues. When the United States was involved in Iraq, we had the support of the Poles, who were busy supporting us militarily. And at the end of that, we did not get a bill for their military service on our behalf, because that's how NATO works. So what it might look like, well, there's been a discussion again about whether Europe, a united Europe, would put forth its own military as a united Europe. I believe it was Chirac and Tony Blair were discussing this after or during the Iraq situation. But at that time, a number of nations had just joined NATO, and 3 of those were former Soviet bloc countries, and they had just joined the European Union. And they were former Soviet bloc countries, and they preferred NATO to having a European Union army. And all the European Union nations need to agree as to whether or not they're going to have their own military force. And at that point, the consensus was to rely on the United States, because at that point we seemed to be reliable. And now, if we're not going to be reliable anymore, and of course the problem is that if we're not reliable on a global stage, or on the global stage, someone else is going to be. A China, for example, someone else will step in, and I'm hopeful that that would be a united Europe, for example, who would replace us as the hegemon rather than an axis of China, North Korea, and Russia with China at the helm. So, yeah, what that would look like initially would be chaos. I think anything that alters a country or alters an existing stable form of an organization tends to be chaotic and destabilizing. So I would anticipate chaos initially and upheaval and a lot of uncertainty, and I would also anticipate economic instability as well, diplomatic unpleasantness, and Americans may not be welcome everywhere anymore, and we may find ourselves being isolated, especially if Trump is going to be buddy with Putin. And we may find that a lot of people from the United States are not going to want to stay in the United States either, because we're not going to feel safe internally.
Oh, I mean, that's something that you hear a lot of threats on. I heard that in 2016. Trump gets elected, I'm moving out. Well, there really wasn't that move. Didn't really happen. All right, Scott, what do you think? Do you think that there's a possibility? Now, Brooke brings up a good point that a law was passed in Congress that says that a president can't unilaterally just leave NATO. However, if there is a Republican Congress, then there's a possibility. So what do you think? Do you think that that's a viable, or you just think it's a threat?
Ditto.
Ditto. Okay.
Yeah. So okay. Yes, Congress has passed a law. I don't know whether Biden has signed it or not. I believe he would if he hasn't, or will if he hasn't. I don't know what would be the holdup, but maybe he just wants to make a big showing of it after Trump does another one of his pronouncements that he's going to leave NATO. Again, as the gun people point out all the time, outlaws don't follow the law. So what's the point of laws? Trump's not going to pay attention to any kind of restraints. In the last administration, I believe the list goes something like John Bolton, Mark Kelly, Rex Tillerson. Let me just think of who else it would have been. It would have been a whole bunch of people in that administration that won't be there the next time that stopped him from leaving NATO and other treaties, by the way, because NATO is just the most famous of all these alliances and treaties and things like that we have or are organizing. It would be a disaster. I believe Mike Pompeo told him that he couldn't leave NATO. So you got Jim Mattis, John Kelly, Rex Tillerson, Mike Pompeo, probably even Mike Pence, John Bolton. All of them who were there the first time will not be there the second time. The second Trump administration would have Stephen Miller and Kash Patel and Marjorie Taylor Greene and who the hell knows who else. And that would be his brain trust. And they're not going to stop him from doing anything that he wants to do. And I would advise anybody who's listening to this podcast that they hunt down the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025 and see what they have in mind for this country. Some of it is not actually included in there, apparently, in the 2025 plan, but includes more Christo-fascist type of things that they want to bring into law. Non-white Christians will become more like second-class citizens, according to this, than good Americans or real Americans are. NATO and AUKUS and the rest of the treaties will be secondary to the chaos that he would cause right here in this country. And yet, as we see, Republicans continue to vote for him. And I do think that in one sense, and I don't want to ramble too much, but in one sense, he's got them over a barrel in the primary, because I think they understand that if Nikki Haley wins the primary somehow, that Trump's not going away. He's not just going to go, oh, well, I guess I lost, and he's going to walk away. This is existential to him. And so he would run as a third party candidate. It would mean that a Democrat would be elected because he would split the Republican vote. And so they don't really have a reasonable alternative to Trump right now. And the threat that he poses to the country is just the same as the threat he poses to the Republican Party and to the rest of the world. But I do want to, and I know I'm going on a bit here, but
that's okay.
But I do want to say that Trump did leave one treaty, or it's not quite a treaty, the JCPOA with Iran. So that was, what was the name of it? The G5+1 or something like that formed that alliance to prevent Iran from ever getting a nuclear bomb. And there were all kinds of things that they got for that. And, the Republicans made a big deal about pallets of cash arriving in Tehran and things like that, using old footage from something else that had happened years ago, saying that, we've given them all this money and they're going to spend it on terrorism. But the bottom line there is that what that ended up doing, in effect, simply by leaving that treaty, was it increased oil prices per gallon across the world, because now all of a sudden you pulled Iran's oil off of the market. And that was a big boon, like $14 billion a year, I think it was, for Vladimir Putin, who at that time was suffering because oil prices had dropped down to something like $15 or $16 a barrel. And now it's shot up again to like 75 a barrel. And so one of the theories behind that is that the reason that Trump left that treaty, and everybody in his administration saying, no, Iran is complying, you can't leave the treaty, this is a really good deal, and Trump left anyway, is on behalf of Vladimir Putin. And that's all I have to say about that.
So, okay, before I move on to Priscilla, what do you think that the politics of the world might look like if the United States was to leave NATO?
Yeah, I mean, I think other countries would probably step up to fill in the void, and as Brooke said, China would be become a more major player than it is today. Probably, the world would be less safe. I mean, there's no chance that Russia has not invaded Baltic countries because of the Baltic countries. They haven't invaded those countries because of NATO and because of the threat of the United States behind them. So that would be something that would certainly be, a consideration for them. So, and certainly if there was no NATO and nobody supplying Ukraine with funding, which may happen anyway, with us still being in NATO, then once Russia and Ukraine are united, that's an empire. That's a big, powerful country. And Putin knows that he needs Ukraine to reconstitute the Russian Empire. And once that is together, and I don't know what that would look like exactly, as the Ukrainians lose their freedom and the country is wiped off the map, then he's free to do whatever he wants to do in Europe. And there's very little that anybody could do to stop him.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that Ukraine gives him access to Crimea, which allows him a seaport. And then the Baltic states, which have more seaports again to use. We always think of Russia's landmass. The fact is that the eastern side of Russia does not have that many areas because it's pretty much desolate to use as seaports. So having those seaports conveniently toward Europe is definitely a benefit to Russia. So Priscilla, is it a threat, or do you think it's a possibility?
I mean, I think it's a possibility, but I think it's a stupid idea.
I think we all agree that it's a stupid idea.
It's another one of those let's do the thing because our feathers are ruffled and it makes our constituents happy that we're doing the thing, when in reality, there's no thought of the bigger impact. I think, Scott, you're absolutely right that the impact is going to be on our own country before that's where we're going to feel it first. But not having the protections that NATO provides, really not the protections, but the container that NATO provides, is going to open world politics to do all sorts of the crazy things. Putin doing what Putin's doing, and all those folks in South America and in China doing the things that they're doing. But on the other hand, maybe it's not necessarily NATO that's holding that back. So it's like, if it's not us pulling out of NATO, there may be something else on the horizon anyway. And so NATO is just kind of the fun little acronym that people can either rally for or against at the moment.
Okay. So do you see the United Nations stepping up? That was the other part of the question. Would the United Nations be able to step up and take the place of NATO? And I think we all have an answer to that one. I see Scott shaking his head no.
I'm shaking my head almost off. It's almost coming off my neck. No, the UN would not be a substitute.
Brooklyn, is the UN? No, you're shaking your head no as well, so you're not seeing it. And of course, Priscilla's saying no. And of course, I definitely would say no. They can't agree on much of anything. So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsors for this episode. BH Conflict Resolution Services, a full-service dispute resolution firm offering expert and cost-effective mediation services to couples, groups, and businesses. BHCRS can be reached at www.bhcrs.com. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, our editing partners, and Podkite, who does all of our analytics. iHeartRadio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source for music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all of these and other quality platforms. We'd like to thank all of our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershworth, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.